Hi, folks. I'm Todd Tanner, and I'm here around the fire today with Dylan Tomine and Jock Cunningham. And we're talking politics today, which is the thing of the season. We're a few weeks out from the election, and politics are important not only to everyday all Americans, but also to sportsmen. And so we're gonna sort of dive down in the weeds a little bit today. And I just wanted to ask Dylan to start out, why do we have such a divergence on both sides of the political aisle? I mean, we have some incredibly important issues for politicians to talk about, for folks on the GOP side and the Democratic side to talk about, but they can't seem to come together. So we're looking at climate change, we're looking at public lands, we're looking at all these truly important issues to sportsmen. But man, they can't seem to get together. Why is that?
Well, we've gotten to a point where people are just trying to shout over each other. And certainly, as we all know from school, you know, that if we raise our hands and speak in turn, we tend to actually communicate better. So I agree with you. I think there's some really important topics coming up that are critical to this election. If you are a fisherman or a hunter or a hiker or a boater, particularly the ones you mentioned earlier. I think the big picture of climate change, that being off in the future is over. We're seeing, tremendous storms coming through off the Atlantic and the Caribbean and the Southeast, swamping people. At the same time, the West Coast has been on fire. We've had smoke here for so many days. It's like, it's hard to imagine, like this didn't happen 10 years ago out here. And you have pine bark beetle spread. So all these things that are going on, that's just the big picture, long-term picture of climate change. And I think more importantly, when you talk about public lands access, when you talk about clean water, the things that we as sportsmen need are on the ballot. And really, I think the difficult thing for voters now is that if you are traditionally a GOP voter, you find yourself at odds with a party that is denying climate change, withdrawing from climate accords, trying to, sell off public lands and close down access, repealing Clean Water Acts. Those are things that I think are really dangerous to you as a voter if you like being outside.
So, Jock, my hope has always been, as an adult, that politicians from both major parties would offer thoughtful, intelligent solutions to really difficult questions. And they would compete for my vote, right? That's what I wanted my entire life. And you would think, well, maybe that isn't going to happen across the broad spectrum of the American political world, but God, it should be able to happen with stuff that's really important to those of us who care about hunting and angling and the outdoors and conservation. Why can't we seem to come across that? Why can't we find that?
I think the money in politics is too big. I think the complete failure to control campaign finance and dark money, campaign finance abuses and dark money has driven a lot of that. And I kind of fight, particularly in a state like Montana, the GOP Democrat divide. It's not like every Democrat is a friend of the environment and conservation.
No.
But it has gotten to the point where Republicans who had such a distinguished history in conservation legislation, right? A lot of the bedrock laws were passed either in a bipartisan way or signed by a Republican president. I think some of it is coming down to kind of the coastal elites, quote unquote, versus interior U.S., the people. And whoever is pushing this, or if it is spontaneous, and I don't really think it's spontaneous at the risk of veering into conspiracy theories, I think they're doing a great job selling the politics of fear and using all this loudmouth opinion journalism rather than fact-based journalism to sell that. And you look at it now, I mean, you're right. You're talking about fire and water supply and disease and really fundamental nonpartisan issues. But just to jump to public lands, we got a president who calls himself a populist president, and all his supporters say he's a populist. Well, we have 30 million acres of public land in Montana. That makes you and I and every other public landowner as wealthy as one of the Wilkes brothers. It's a flag of populism to be able to hunt on that, or fish or hike on that much public land. But right now in the Republican National Committee platform and the Montana Republican Committee platform, it explicitly spells out that it is for the transfer of public lands.
So that's insane, right? I mean, that's literally nuts. Why would either political party ever say, we want to get rid of our public lands when that's such a huge part of our heritage? Dylan, you don't have anything like that going on in Washington State, do you?
No, I mean, we have some of the same issues. I think most of the states in the West have those issues. But I want to just go back to something Jack was saying that I think is really interesting, is that I've thought about this a lot, and my thinking around it started with this idea when it came from talking to my kids. And my daughter, who's 16, has said, the first thing she does when she goes to a new classroom is to look for where she would hide or where she would escape if a shooter came in. I mean, that's a heartbreaking thing for a kid to tell you. And then she also talked a lot about what she's going to have to deal with as far as climate change when she's my age. And so I started thinking, well, the GOP is looking at this huge wave of young voters that are coming up that are really angry that we didn't protect them with more sensible gun regulation, that we didn't do what it took to stop climate change, and that those are all bills that they're having to pay for our lack of action. And so to me, I started thinking like, well, the Republican Party is driving these things, and what appears to be a hugely unpopular position on lots of subjects, among the next wave of voters that's coming up. And I thought, boy, they really don't have any long-term strategy to survive as a party. Like, how are they going to do this? And then, like Jock said, I started looking at the money that comes into the GOP, that it mostly comes from these large corporate interests. And when you look at how those large corporate, especially the resource extraction corporations, how they operate, they don't have a long-term strategy. Their mandate is to make quarterly projections every 3 months so that the stock prices stay afloat, right? So I think what you have is a party that has very short-sighted vision for what America needs from its government, supported by a donor base that is very short-sighted by habit as far as, I'm not even talking about if we destroy the land with our oil drilling. I'm just talking about 3 months from now making the projections that the analysts put up for them to keep the stock prices right. So it started to make more sense to me that you have this sort of system of short-sightedness built on top of more short-sightedness. And as somebody who is a fisherman and a hunter, that scares me to death, because the things that we need, like clean water and access to public lands that are in good shape, those are things that require long-term vision. And I'm not saying that Democrats have it figured out and they have this long-term vision. I'm just saying that it's most clearly, obviously against the interests of outdoors people when you look at the Republican platform, both at the national and, like Jock said, at the state level.
I'd argue that is a pretty recent phenomenon.
Yes.
And I mean, Republicans, it wasn't that long ago where I didn't agree with everything, but they were sort of the party of fiscal responsibility and deficit control and so forth. They have rejected that wholesale. That has gone out the window. My father served in 2 wars as a combat Marine, rock-ribbed Republican. When he had a stroke and asked me to take over his finances, his accountant and I were going through and finished his taxes, and he asked me where I was on Mitt Romney and the Romney election. And I said, well, you know, to shorten it up, I said, I think he's a decent guy. It's just not in me to support tax cuts for the rich. Our wealth polarization in this country is growing worse and worse every year, and the wealthy don't need another tax cut. And he said, you're just like your dad. I said, what? Both of us, I think, would take issue with that, because we argued about politics every day of our lives. And he said, yeah, your dad last year, he said at the end of going through taxes, he said, Joe, what's my marginal tax rate? And I said, well, Jack, it's dividends and interest. It's, you know, it's whatever it was, 15.1%. And he said, may I ask you what yours is? And he said, yeah, it's 30%. And Dad said, I'm embarrassed by what my party has become. And that was just a generation ago, that Republicans were community minded, and there were a lot of stuff that would be called socialists now, and this wholesale greed, I think, and Republicans don't have a monopoly on that, but it's gotten so much worse, that short-sighted grab for money and resources, because the money is so big, it's just gotten to Old Testament levels. It's unbelievable.
So do you think, Jack, do you think that is less a traditional Republican stance and more a Trumpism issue? Like, is this what happens when your leader of the party is a real estate developer from New York City?
I think he's brought it to a new nadir. You know, I think it was starting before, and again, I would just, my ex-father-in-law was a commercial fisherman in the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska, and he said it was just a bunch of guys making a living, and then the price of seafood boomed, and that's when the abuses started. That's when the ugly behavior and hammering on the resource really began. And I think that's going on a national level. The money's just gotten too big, too uncontrolled. And I know there are people saying, you know, freedom and liberty, but there's a reason that we have antitrust laws going back here for a century. You know, the stuff about gun control has just gotten crazier and crazier. I probably have a dozen handguns here. I'm a gun guy, but I'm not allowed to have a rocket launcher. I don't need one. You know,
Do you want one? I can get you one if you.
You probably could, you are, but it just doesn't really affect my hunting very much, you know. And I'm not expecting to have to fight off a unit of SEALs here on the Hill.
I have a question for Dylan. Let's step away from the parties for a second and look at the companies, the brands, and the nonprofits who inform and educate sportsmen on all the issues that are important to us. What should they be focused on right now? What should they be looking at and telling us about?
I think right now, you know, I'm probably, I mean, for full disclosure, I am a Patagonia ambassador and work for the company. So I think I'm probably tilted more that way. And as far as environmental activism, you know, Patagonia functions frequently as sort of a self-funded NGO. So I have a view into both. I work quite closely with a number of these NGOs, like, you know, Wild Fish Conservancy and Native Fish Society, Wild Steelhead Coalition. And I honestly believe the best thing that all of these groups and the manufacturers should be doing right now, this minute, is encouraging registration and going out to vote and educating. I think part of what we're doing with a program like this is to talk about some of the different angles, and there's going to be people who agree and disagree with us, but I don't think that, I mean, not in my lifetime has there ever been an election that's this consequential, not even just about outdoor interests and resource extraction and public lands and climate change, but I think, you know, it's going to be pretty consequential about our bedrock beliefs as a republic, as a democracy. I think there's a lot on the line here not to mention a pandemic that we're trying to deal with, which is why we're on this Zoom call. So I feel like if there was one message to come out of all of the groups that you mentioned, the NGOs, the manufacturers, is that you need to register and vote. And I just think that that's the most critical thing right now. We have, if you live in Washington State, you have until October 26th to register. And I encourage you to register now so there isn't a rush, and vote as early as you can. I think that's the one thing going out of this whole show that we're fortunate enough to be a part of right now, is that if there's one message, is that please vote like your future and your life and your kids depend on it, because it does.
Amen. Amen. Jock, you are involved with a conservation organization that is, pretty involved in getting the word out. You want to tell us just a little bit about that?
Let me underscore Dylan's point. I've heard very intelligent people in conservation say it really doesn't matter who's in office, that they don't remember. One guy who I think the world of at TU National said to me once, I don't remember my life being a lot simpler under Gore and Clinton than it is under Bush and Cheney. And I looked at him and said, I got to disagree with you. And here's why. Your government, with your tax dollars, spends billions of dollars on things that affect ecosystems. And most of the best work I did at TU National was working with county departments of public works, state DOTs, FEMA, Forest Service, BLM, entities that control tens to hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars annually. And the signature that they exert on hydrologic budgets, on sediment budgets, fish passage, elk refuge habitat, it's profound. So to get to your point, Todd, your question, I'm board chair of Montana Conservation Voters. And I left the Montana BHA board, which I loved being with.
And for folks who don't know, what's BHA?
Backcountry hunters and anglers. A bunch of men and women just like myself, spent a lot of time outside, great to be with, the fastest growing conservation organization in the country, I think still. It was a hoot. And, skinny little tan people. And I went to this bunch of kind of pale, cranky, hard drinking political operatives when I joined the MCV board, because it's a dirty business. It's a depressing business, and it's certainly been going in the wrong direction. And I just decided I had to do it, even though I didn't understand the vocabulary, I didn't understand the logic, but the mission was so important. What happens in our state and national capitals really makes a difference. And I'll give you a very small example. We, for the 2018 elections, we have a bunch of priorities, but just on a very local example, we saw opportunities to really swing the Missoula Board of County Commissioners and the Billings City Council, not to conservation-friendly entities, but to being populated by conservation champions. And to watch what they're doing now, they're applying for grants and doing all this long-range planning on fire risk and headwater catchment hydrology, and they're taking the ball and running. And you brought up a fundamental point. I think early on, the proper role of government is one, military, that's in the Constitution, but also on a conceptual level, it's mediating between individual and group interests and short-term and long-term interests. That's what it should be doing. That's what good government does. And boy, it's just swung way too far to one end of those two continuum, those two pendulums. It's the individual and it's short term, and that's at our peril.
Well, we hear an awful lot about freedom and about our rights, but we rarely hear the flip side of that, the other side of the coin, which is responsibility. And I mean, that has to be balanced, right? We've got to balance those two things. On one hand, we need our freedoms protected. On the other hand, we need to step up and act as if we're aware of the fact that we have responsibilities not only to ourselves, but to our kids and our grandkids. So Dylan, you were talking about voting before, and that sort of caught my attention. And I wanted to ask you how the results, how the impacts of our voting become personal for us and for our families and for the places where we live and where we recreate. What do you see? What's personal, or what will the results be that are personal?
Well, I think, well, that's a great question, because in some ways, everything the government does has some impact on all of our lives, right? And so I think, if we're talking for hunters and fishermen and rafters and skiers and that kind of thing, I think right away, access to public lands and non-transfer of public lands to resource extraction corporations is I forgot how many. I think Jack said there was how many acres in Montana of public land?
30 million.
Yeah, I mean, staggering amounts of land that I think for years we've taken for granted, that we can drive to a place and walk into the hills and shoot an elk or hunt grouse, or by the same token, I kind of lump these together, but the current administration has rolled back the clean water rules that were put in place under the previous administration. And I think a lot of us in the West, especially the Mountain West or the Coastal West, took for granted that you would have watersheds that could support salmon or steelhead or trout. And that it was, it was my personal right that I could go out there and fish and catch some salmon or steelhead, just the same way as, Jock can walk out his door and go a very short distance and have access to public lands to hunt. I think those are really stark impacts to the typical outdoorsman, that in this particular election, if you vote for the party that is trying to close down access, allow more pollution of water, transfer, these public lands, I think when you want to go and all of a sudden it's not there, and or the water is polluted or warm, or there's a gate across the access to where you were going to go elk hunting, I think those are touching you pretty personally. Like that's an impact that's not theoretical.
Dylan, you want to hear a cool fact?
Yeah.
The role of Forest Service lands in preserving headwater catchments and providing a sustainable water supply to the American West, that was in the original authorizing language of the Forest Service. And
really?
It was recognized back then. And, in Gifford Pinchot's time. And fishing buddy of my grandfather's, actually. It's obnoxious to say, but in Pennsylvania.
Gifford Pinchot, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And fishing brings it all together. Then, there's some great books on the history of the Forest Service, but essentially that role of Forest Service lands was not discussed for a long time until Mike Dombeck was service head for Clinton. And he was the first person to point it out, and to point out that, major clear cuts, that dense road building that converts shallow groundwater, intercepts shallow groundwater, turns it into runoff water, the changes in fine sediment loading in headwaters, that is flies in the face of their multiple use mandate and authorizing goals.
Yeah, the other thing I want to just add, this is a little bit tangential to what we're talking about, but I think I really wanted us to talk a little bit about that we need to be really careful with our votes as well, because there has been a late in the game concerted effort to greenwash, or I guess I should say camo wash, a number of Republican candidates to make them look like they are friendly to the outdoors people. And I'm talking specifically about Senators Daines and Gardner's kudos they got around the Great American Outdoor Act. If you look at Daines and Gardner's, Jock, you mentioned this before, if you look at Daines and Gardner, their long-term voting record is horrible if you're a hunter or a fisherman.
As bad as it, and in fact, Daines fought the LWCF full funding. He voted against full funding or just stalled for years.
Yeah,
for years.
so, and I think so. That's one example, but it was really throwing a lifeline to get a little bit more of the outdoors people's votes for guys that are in tough contests right now, and that was sort of thrown to them. The other example is this late in the game, quote unquote, protection of Pebble Mine or Bristol Bay by the Army Corps rejection of the Pebble Mine permit, which really is temporary and only a reversal of another Trump administration approval of moving ahead with that. And it really concerns me when a lot of our very visible conservation NGOs took the bait and are, in fact, you know, they're leader of one of the really big cold water fisheries organizations sent out a video saying that we owe a debt of gratitude to President Trump for saving Bristol Bay with the Pebble Mine assessment. I think even later in the game, when you look at the tapes that came out around Pebble Mine, that you can see just how dirty that business is that you were talking about earlier, Jock. But that's one thing. I don't want to go too far down that hole, but I think it's really important that we step back, and when you're assessing who you're voting for, if the outdoors access or ability to be able to fish and hunt is your primary concern, or one of your important concerns, is that you look into the long-term record of the people that might be suddenly getting a bunch of kudos around conservation.
So Jock, give me a minute or a minute and a half on what American voters need to know before this upcoming election.
They need to do their due diligence. They need to get into the meat of the stories that Dylan was referring to. They need to vote for these longer term processes. They need to realize how much there is to lose.
Yes.
In of our outdoor heritage and our water supplies and water quality, biologic integrity. It's in the original purpose of the Clean Water Act. It is, oh boy, I'm going to forget it now, but it addresses biologic integrity, and how that came down to being defined just by water quality chemical parameters is beyond me. I've queued up environmental lawyers saying, sue all the federal agencies for failure to conform to that mandate. I think they need to think about who their friends and their enemies were. And I think they need to realize how powerful they would be if they voted in a more coordinated way. And you asked about Montana conservation voters, and the hard lesson I've learned is the two tough jobs is increasing our dialogue across the aisle and I mean across the conservation averse aisle, not in a partisan sense. The other hard lesson is, in that field, you are respected to the degree that you're feared, to the degree that you have power. And MCV can flex that power, so can outdoors people. They really can, if they kind of get their priorities in order. In Montana, 75% of Montana voters, of Montanans, all Montanans, say they're conservation oriented, but they sure don't vote that way.
So Dylan, if you had the opportunity to sit down with voters from Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Florida and North Carolina today, and you knew that they were going to leave from your conversation and go cast their ballots, what would you tell them?
That's a great question. I think it depends who the voters are that I'm talking to, what the demographic is. But for the sake of this program, let's say that there are people who like to fish and hunt. And I think my message would be really clear that, you know, as Jock mentioned earlier, the preservation of fishing and hunting opportunity is a long-term proposition. And that most of the people that you have an opportunity to vote for, the candidates, have a long-term record behind them of how they've voted in the past, like the things they've stood for. And so I would really ask that if your priorities are to hunt and fish and have those things affordable and available, I'm not a rich man, so I'm really dependent on public access. And I think there's a lot of other people like that. You know, it's different if you're one of the Trump kids and you're going to expensive lodges and doing all that. Maybe then you don't need to vote for public lands so much. But if you're like the rest of us, like me, public lands are everything for our recreation. And so I think I would say, please think about the access and the viability of these public opportunities and clean water for yourself. And your kids and their kids, because it's finite. Like if we mine and drill and cut and burn, we're not going to get it back. Like that's going to be gone. And so I think that it is really critical that you think long term for the future, and just really, like, I think the one message is, if you look at all the factors when you cast your ballot, please just don't shoot yourself in the foot. If you vote for things that are really in your own best interest, the majority that wins that will be, the benefits will be for all of us.
No, I could not agree more. You know, we're going to wrap up, and the last thing I'll say about this is that all these things are personal for us. If we're talking climate change, the impacts are personal. If we're talking public lands,
yeah,
it's personal, especially here in the West, for those of us who get out on the landscape. I mean, I love to hunt. I love to fish. Those are things I'm passionate about. I know both of you guys are as well. And I'm really hoping that as we go forward, we're going to see sportsmen and women voting for the things that they care about and voting to give their kids and their grandkids an opportunity going forward. So I am so thankful to Jock and to Dylan, both of you guys, for taking the time to join us today around the fire. And thank you for an incredible conversation. Guys, take care.
Thank you.
Much.